Hello, everybody. This is the second lecture for endocrine. You saw the first one. Hopefully today sometime you'll see it. It's already posted and it's made public. And here's the second one. We're going to focus on the hypothalamus and the pituitary in this lecture, right? And I'll go back and forth between this and my PowerPoint. So here we go. Endocrine 2. All right. So we're going to talk about the hypothalamus and the pituitary. If you remember from chapter 12, I believe in 141, the hypothalamus regulates a lot of homeostatic functions. You have some things we'll talk about here, some things we talked about more in chapter 12, such as sleep-wake cycle. Water retention and thirst regulated by the hypothalamus. Now the hypothalamus secretes hormones through the anterior pituitary and it works in the posterior pituitary. So the anterior pituitary, the hormones it's secreting are tropic hormones, meaning they control the release of other hormones. Now the anterior pituitary itself has a lot of tropic hormones. Something to be careful about here. Tropic is different than trophic. Trophic means inducing growth. Now some tropic hormones are also trophic, but we're really going to talk about tropic hormones. Here, sorry about the cat. All right, so where is the hypothalamus? It's here in the diencephalon, hypo, just below, inferior to the thalamus. You have the pituitary hanging down from the hypothalamus by the infundibulum, this little stalk. We'll see it more, and here we go, better picture here. See this, the infundibulum. You really want to know that. Hypothalamus, infundibulum, pituitary, and you have your anterior pituitary and your posterior pituitary. All right. Now, the pituitary is fun because it has another name. Pituitary is also the hypophysis. Now, that's different from hypothesis. It's hypophysis. You see right here. The pituitary is a hypophysis. This was actually on your terminology list for the last neuro exam for Bio 141. But it really helps to remember that the pituitary is a hypophysis because the connections between the hypothalamus and the pituitary have the term hypophysis in them. So let's talk about what those connections are. Your anterior pituitary, you have the hypothalamic, okay, hypothalamus, hypothalamic, hypophyseal. So this is where you want to know hypophysis. Hypothalamic, hypophyseal tract. And these are neurons running down the infundibulum to the posterior pituitary. Remember from Bio 141 in chapter 11, we learned that a tract is a bundle of neurons, the axons, I should say, of neurons. So hypothalamic, hypophyseal tract, hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary. And what's happening here is your hypothalamus is going to make the hormones, transport them. If you guys remember that anterograde transport, I do not quiz on that here. That was chapter 11. But it transports them down here to the posterior pituitary where they are released and into the bloodstream. These are capillaries. All right, so what about the anterior pituitary? Hypothalamus connected to the anterior pituitary through a portal vein. Isn't that interesting? So what is exactly a portal vein? Portal vein is something that connects two capillary beds instead of going back to the heart first. So you have capillary bed in the hypothalamus and then a vein going straight down to the capillary beds in the pituitary, also known as the hypophysis. So this vein is called the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal vein, hypothalamic hypophyseal portal vein, connecting the capillaries in the hypothalamus to capillaries in the anterior pituitary. Pretty fun, right? All right, so posterior pituitary, is it making any hormones? It's not, right? It's just secreting what is made in the hypothalamus. These hormones are made in the hypothalamus, transported down, and released. What about the anterior pituitary? Well, the hypothalamus is secreting tropic hormones, and those are going to induce release of hormones down here in the anterior pituitary. So it is making its own hormones, and it's releasing them. So this is going to be glandular tissue. Over here, it's neural tissue, because you have the axons and the synaptic terminals from the hypothalamic hypophyseal tract. Does that make sense so far? All right. So go back to the PowerPoint. All right, so we covered this hypophysis. Oh, and since it's glandular tissue, it's called the adenohypophysis. And the posterior pituitary is also called the neurohypophysis. You want to know those two terms. I believe they're on your lab terminology sheet. So if not for lecture, at least for lab, you have to know them. I'd know them for both. Alrighty. 7. Okay, so here's just another picture of it. Hypothalamus, infundibulum, anterior and posterior pituitary. We talked about the portal vein. We talked about this, how no hormones are actually made in the posterior pituitary. And you have the tract. All right, so which hormones are actually released from the posterior pituitary? Well, one that we discussed last night, ADH, an antidiuretic hormone. So, ADH. All right, so ADH is released from the posterior pituitary. What does ADH do? Well, ADH inserts these things called aquaporins. And aquaporins, what do you think that is? Aqua, water, porins, pore. A little water pore into the kidney tubules. We'll talk about it during urinary quite a bit. But the kidneys have this concentration gradient that pulls the water back in. And if you don't have the pores, it doesn't matter how much gradient you have. Water can't get through. But with the aquaporins, water can get through. And if you can imagine, the more aquaporins you have, the more water is getting pulled back into the body. So antidiuretic hormone decreases the urine volume. All right. And so this is something we always need a little bit of. So it's always secreted in small amounts, but it can be secreted in larger amounts as well. You can imagine that this is something you want to secrete if the blood volume was too low, right? To increase the water retention, increase blood volume. All right. And what exactly secretes it? Well, when you have an action potential calming down these neurons, the axons, then they release, once it gets to the end, they release their the hormone stored in synaptic vesicles, goes down and gets into the bloodstream. All right, now what if you don't have this? What would happen? Incredibly high urine volume, right? About 15 liters a day, or it can be up to 15 liters a day. And they call this diabetes insipidus. Now it's different from diabetes mellitus. It's not, glucose is not a player in this one. What's happening is simply low ADH and no aquaporins, or very little aquaporins in the kidney tubules. So less water retention, the water can't get pulled back in. So it comes out high urine volume, low blood pressure, very dangerous. All right. Next hormone in the anterior pituitary, There's only two here, so makes it a little bit easier. You have oxytocin. I'm just going to write it here by ADH. Oxytocin. All right, so oxytocin does the milk letdown reflex, and it is positive feedback. It also is involved in childbirth in the smooth muscle of the uterus, and positive feedback there. It's a lot of fun to have positive feedback hormones, because there's only a couple that we talk about. So as far as the loop, once the stimulus is stopped, that's what stops the hormone release. But as long as there's a stimulus, the hormone release is increasing. Okay, now anterior pituitary. Here's where we have that portal vein. So these are tropic hormones that are coming down and oftentimes releasing other tropic hormones, but not always. Okay, and how are they traveling down? By the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal vein. Now here's what's fun. If these are tropic hormones, and some of these are, if the hypothalamic hormones are tropic hormones, and many of the adenohypophyseal hormones or the anterior pituitary hormones are tropic hormones, then we kind of have different levels of hormone release, right? Like 1, 2, and then the tissue they're going to. So let's say thyroid, oh, you know what, let me switch to. So let's say, so tier 1, tier 2, you can have your thyroid, or maybe the adrenal gland, so tier 3, and then these would have the more systemic effects. All right. Does that make sense? So we have different tiers. Here I've written out some. Tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and the effects. So we can go through some of the hormones that we discussed. How about adrenocorticotropic hormone released from the anterior pituitary? What's releasing that in the hypothalamus? Corticotropin releasing hormone. And remember the R is for releasing. If you see releasing, think hypothalamus. So corticotropin releasing hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, cortisol, and we'll talk more about cortisol and its effects in the adrenal lecture. But for now, I really want you to understand these tiers. Corticotropin releasing hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, and cortisol. All right, so how about thyroid hormone? Oh, I should do that one in pink. Oh. So thyroid hormone, what starts the releasing for thyroid hormone? Thyroid releasing hormone. And then what stimulates the actual thyroid? And what does the thyroid actually make? Thyroid hormone. So thyroid releasing hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, and thyroid hormone. All right, what else do we have? How about gonadotropin releasing hormone? GnRH. What does that one stimulate? It gets 2 different hormones, right? So it has LH, luteinizing hormone, and FSH. What do those stimulate? let's say estrogen and testosterone. So let's also consider here another one that's not going all the way down, but that can easily be confused with gonadotropin releasing hormone. What do you think that one is? What one's similar to this? How about GHRH? GHRH, growth hormone releasing hormone. So see how all of these have releasing in them? And that's going to release growth hormone. And this one just has 2 tiers. We'll go straight down to effects. All right, does that make sense, everyone? And you see how gonadotropin releasing hormone and growth hormone releasing hormone, not the same thing, but easy to mix up when you're stressed taking an exam. So we have our different tiers. Hypothalamus, tier 1, pituitary, tier 2, and many of them go on from the pituitary, tropic hormones, stimulate other glands like thyroid and adrenal or the gonads. Does that make sense? Okay. Let's go back to the PowerPoint. All right, so the tiers we discussed. Oh, and here they are written out. First tier, second tier, third tier, and then the effects. Now, see how in blue here it talks about homeostatic variables? This is interesting because you don't want the hormone released when you don't need it, right? So a lot of times you have a negative feedback from the hormone. So like thyroid hormone is going to inhibit thyroid stimulating hormone and thyroid releasing hormone. Growth hormone will inhibit growth hormone releasing hormone, and it'll stimulate an inhibitor for itself. All right, does that make sense? So you can also have the effects here, stimulating or providing negative feedback. All right, so we talked a little bit about these. Thyroid stimulating hormone, development of the thyroid. We're gonna have a whole little segment on thyroid. And adrenocorticotropic hormone, same thing. We're gonna have a whole segment on adrenocorticotropic hormone. Prolactin, we won't have any more on, but you have prolactin releasing hormone, prolactin inhibiting hormone, which is really interesting because that is actually dopamine. When I was a student, they just called it prolactin inhibiting factor or hormone, but when I started teaching, I learned that they had actually discovered it was dopamine, which is pretty fun. So what does this do? It initiates the milk production after childbirth and maintains milk. So when the baby sucks, it stimulates for the mother to make more milk. And it's one of those positive feedback hormones. Some of these positive feedback hormones you can remember as they're both involved in childbirth and nursing. In one of the two or both. All right. Which sort of makes sense, by the way, because childbirth, you're starting in one place and going to another, right? You don't want to get back to where you started. Same thing with milk production. As long as the baby needs the milk, you want to keep going to that state of making milk. So I think of positive feedback as starting in one location, ending in another. I think of negative feedback. You start in one location, that variable changes, maybe thyroid hormone gets too low, and then you make more, but you go back to where you started, right? You go back to that set point. Positive feedback, you're going to a different point. Does that make sense? Let me know if it does not, please. Because we'll see a lot of this, especially in some other chapters. All right, luteinizing hormone or gonadotropin, another name for it, which makes sense because it's gonadotropin releasing hormone stimulates it. All right, so we'll talk a lot about luteinizing hormone in the reproductive chapter. But right now, just know that it's going to stimulate production of estrogen and testosterone. And also progesterone, but I'm really interested in estrogen and testosterone. All right. Follicle stimulating hormone, the same kind of thing. We're going to talk a lot about exactly what those do and their mechanism, a bit about their mechanism in the reproductive chapters. So know that they stimulate the gonads. Growth hormone. This one's fun. All right, you see how it's called somatotropin or somatotropin right here? Let's do this. There we go. Somatotropin. So it's produced and secreted by somatotrophs. But what are trophic factors? Things that induce growth, right? It's somato, body. So growth hormone, body growth, or somato body, tropin growth. It makes sense, doesn't it? All right, so one fun thing, it peaks during sleep, which is really cool. I always tell my kids, go to bed so you can grow more. Not necessarily how it works, but it's worth a try. So this induces growth, especially in cardiac muscle, adipose, liver, cartilage, and bone. And what's fun here is we can have short-term or long-term effects. So let's talk about what those are. Short-term effects: promotes fat breakdown, can promote generation of new glucose in the liver, like gluconeogenesis, and also the breakdown of glycogen. And it can have inhibition of glucose uptake by muscle fibers, so it forces the muscles to use a different source, such as protein. So this, why would it do that? What are you doing here? Are you increasing blood glucose here or decreasing? You're increasing it here. And why? Well, if we're going to grow, we need to take extra nutrients into the cell, right? They need energy to fuel all these reactions for growth and cell division. Makes sense, right? All right, what about long-term effects? This is fun. So while it affects almost every cell in the body by protein synthesis or cell division, it actually, in the long term, decreases blood glucose. So while we talked about short term, it raises blood glucose, long term, it decreases it, and it's insulin-like. So remember your hormone interactions chart? This is something you could put in. The long-term effects, it's pretty similar to insulin by lowering blood glucose. And so how would it do that? If it's putting more glucose in the blood, why is it lowering it long-term? Well, what's happening is the cells that are needing the energy pull it in or allow it in, you know. And and when that happens, the blood glucose goes down. So you're actually lowering blood glucose. You raise it, and then the cells that need it are going to lower it. Okay, growth hormone and insulin-like growth factor, which is promoted by the production of this is promoted by growth hormone. So these are even important in adults for muscle development and regulation of body mass. All right, here's a what would this be called? Chart from your book or a graphic from your book explaining the two different ones. I would know that, and there's a spot on your hormone chart to fill in short-term and long-term effects. It's fun because they're a little bit contradictory, but they work together, right? You raise blood glucose so that the cells that need it can pull it in, which lowers blood glucose. All right, and how do we release growth hormone? Growth hormone releasing hormone, also known as, growth hormone releasing hormone. Now, how do we inhibit it? Growth hormone inhibiting hormone.
It's right there for you.
Thank you, John.
Now you found it on the food shelf.
Oh, that's nice. So we have somatostatin. Remember, somatotropin was another word for growth hormone. Somatostatin, statins lowering. Somatostatin lowers growth, or inhibits, I should say, growth hormone. So here we have, see this right here where the mouse is tracing along, negative feedback of the effects of growth hormone So that's negative feedback to growth hormone itself. But you also have positive feedback. Well, not positive, but you have it stimulates the release of somatostatin, which is going to inhibit growth hormone. Interesting, isn't it?
Wow. That's really cool. Yeah. On the other thing, right? Not on the
Okay. All right, so what happens if we have too much growth hormone? Well, if your epiphyseal plates haven't closed yet, then you can have gigantism because the long bones will be able to grow longer and longer, right? But what if you're like me and the epiphyseal plates have closed? Well, some things can still grow. You have acromegaly, the face, and even the hands can grow. And it can affect the heart and the liver, can even lead to heart failure. So it's dangerous. Well, what if you don't have enough growth hormone? How does that affect? Hyposecretion, too low, would cause short stature. But otherwise, the body would be proportional. All right, so we've talked about the hormones here. We've talked about ADH, oxytocin, that thyroid hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, prolactin, and luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, and growth hormone. Did I talk about that? No. All right. All right. So what about? Have you heard of taking human growth hormone? I knew someone who took it as a pill, but it's not going to get into the body that way because the proteins get broken down in the stomach. So you're not really going to get any into the body that way. Now it could be done by injection, but that can be dangerous. So you can get hyperglycemia, right? The long-term effects are to lower blood glucose. So it's something to use only under a doctor's care if it's needed. All right. Stop share. Let's do a quick review here, guys. So we have our hypothalamus. You have your pituitary, anterior pituitary, posterior pituitary. Pituitary is also called the hypophysis. So we have the anterior pituitary is also called the adenohypophysis. The posterior pituitary is also called the neurohypophysis. Why? Adeno means glandular. So the adenohypophysis or anterior hypophysis has glandular tissue. The neurohypophysis has neural tissue. It seems obvious, but you may have to write this out on an exam at some point. And sometimes it's harder to remember all the terms. So I would draw it out, write it out. Remember the infundibulum is the stalk that's connecting the pituitary to the hypothalamus. And in this, for your posterior pituitary, you have the hypothalamic hypophyseal tract. In the anterior pituitary, you have the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal vein. All right, we talked about ADH and oxytocin as hormones released in the posterior pituitary, but not made in the posterior pituitary, made in the hypothalamus. But then we also have, from the hypothalamus to the pituitary, you have corticotropin releasing hormone, thyroid releasing hormone, gonadotropin releasing hormone, growth hormone releasing hormone, and prolactin releasing hormone, not in the diagram here. So you have adrenocorticotropic hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, LH and FSH, growth hormone, and prolactin being released. 6 hormones released from the anterior pituitary, from this glandular tissue. Remember we talked about the tiers, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. Tier 1 are your tropic hormones from the hypothalamus. Tier 2 are your tropic hormones from the anterior pituitary. Now growth hormone can have trophic and maybe some tropic, but we don't discuss any other hormones here for growth hormone. All right, tier 3, you have the cortisol, thyroid hormone, estrogen, testosterone. We're going to talk about thyroid hormone and parathyroid hormone in the next video. So I'll see you guys then. Thanks for joining me for Zoom last night. All right, take care.